Welcome, and take a slow breath as we step away from modern noise and into a world shaped by belief, blood, memory, and consequence. A world where gods are not distant symbols, but walking forces whose emotions scar the land itself, where prophecy is not a suggestion, but a pressure applied across generations, and where a single life can unravel entire pantheons. Tonight we are entering the complete world of God of War, not as a list of battles or a summary of events, but as a living myth, one that breathes through eras of creation, collapse, and rebirth. A myth where every realm remembers what the gods did to it, and where silence often speaks louder than thunder. This is a story about divinity and its limits, about power mistaken for permanence, about cycles that repeat again and again until someone chooses to endure rather than dominate, and about a man shaped into a weapon who must slowly learn how to stop being one. God of War is not merely the tale of Kratos, though he stands at its center. It is the story of worlds that place their faith in gods, and of what happens when those gods rule through fear, control through prophecy, and refuse to change as we move forward. Everything you hear is drawn from canonical material across the God of War series, including the Greek saga, the Norse era, developer-confirmed lore, in-game dialogue, murals, codex entries, and environmental storytelling. And when interpretation appears, it is woven carefully and quietly, implied through evidence rather than declared outright. Let your breathing slow, let the world fall away, and allow this myth to unfold as it was meant to be heard, not as a legend of rage, but as a chronicle of consequence. The universe of God of War does not exist as a single unified cosmology in the traditional sense, but as a layered and segmented reality where multiple mythological systems coexist side by side, each operating within its own metaphysical boundaries, sustained not by universal law alone, but by belief, territory, and the divine authority that governs it, rather than replacing one another. Pantheons in God of War exist as parallel dominions, each anchored to a geographical and metaphysical region of the world, meaning that the Greek world, the Norse lands, and other unseen realms function simultaneously, yet remain largely isolated, unless a being of sufficient power or knowledge crosses those boundaries deliberately. This structure explains why the destruction of Olympus does not erase the 9 realms, and why the fall of the Norse gods does not rewrite the laws that once governed Greece. Because each pantheon is not a chapter in a linear history, but a self-contained system, complete with its own creation myth, its own rules of fate, and its own method of collapse. At the foundation of each mythological system lies a creation event, not necessarily the creation of all existence, but the shaping of a particular world and its governing forces. And these events are remembered differently depending on the culture and the gods who survived long enough to record them. In the Greek world, creation begins with primordial forces emerging from chaos, entities that embody raw concepts rather than personalities, while in the Norse lands, existence is structured around the world tree and the tension between fire and ice. Yet both systems are equally real within the larger world, neither overriding the other. This coexistence suggests that reality in God of War is not governed by a single truth, but by multiple truths operating at once, each enforced by the gods who maintain them. And as long as those gods live and their systems remain intact, their version of reality persists. Fate operates differently within each pantheon, yet always serves the same function: to bind gods and mortals alike to outcomes that reinforce the existing order. And when fate is broken, it is not reality that shatters first, but the authority of the gods who depended on it. In the Greek saga, fate is woven by the Sisters of Fate, external arbiters, who exist beyond the gods themselves, while in the Norse era, prophecy is embedded into murals, runes, and giant knowledge, suggesting a more distributed form of destiny that still funnels events toward collapse. Despite these differences, fate in God of War is never neutral. It serves power, it protects hierarchies, and it punishes deviation, meaning that those who benefit most from prophecy are often the ones who enforce it most violently. Realms themselves are not simply locations, but expressions of divine influence shaped over time by the actions and emotions of the gods who rule them, which is why the death of a god causes immediate environmental consequences. Seas recede, plagues spread, the sun disappears, and entire regions wither or burn. This connection between God and land reveals a core truth of the God of War universe. Divinity is not separate from the world. It is embedded within it, and when a god falls, the wound is carved into reality itself. Travel between pantheons is possible, but it is rare and dangerous, requiring either immense power, forgotten pathways, or assistance from forces that exist between systems. And the difficulty of this passage is intentional, designed to prevent gods from interfering in domains not their own. This separation maintains balance, not through peace, but through isolation, ensuring that the collapse of one divine order does not immediately destabilize all others, allowing the world to survive. Even as entire mythologies burn, magic too is localized, shaped by cultural understanding and divine origin, which is why Greek magic, rooted in sacrifice and elemental dominance, differs fundamentally from Norse magic, tied to runes, cider, and knowledge. Yet both draw power from belief and ritual. Mortals exist beneath these systems, adapting to whichever pantheon rules their land, often unaware that other gods exist at all, their understanding of reality limited by what their rulers allow them to know. This ignorance is not accidental. Gods benefit from being seen as absolute, singular, and eternal, and knowledge of other pantheons would weaken that illusion, planting the idea that gods can fall and, worse, be replaced. The world of God of War is therefore not a universe of endless possibility, but one of constrained paths, tightly controlled by divine forces, who fear change more than death. And this fear becomes the seed of every apocalypse that follows. When a pantheon collapses, what remains is not a blank slate, but a scarred world, struggling to survive without the structure that once defined it, a place where mortals must rebuild without divine guidance, and where the absence of gods becomes as dangerous as their presence once was. This is the stage upon which Kratos is born, not into a simple world of heroes and monsters, but into a system designed to consume him, shape him, and discard him once his purpose is fulfilled. Understanding this structure is essential, because every act of violence, every betrayal, and every attempt at redemption that follows is not merely personal. It is a reaction to a world built to perpetuate cycles of domination and collapse. And it is within this carefully constructed reality, rigid yet fragile, that the story of gods, titans, fathers, sons, and broken fate truly begins. Before gods ruled, and long before mortals learned to pray, the world of God of War existed in a raw, unfinished state, shaped not by intention or morality, but by collision, pressure, and force. And within this early reality emerged the Primordials, beings born not from lineage, worship, or hierarchy, but from fundamental concepts given form, entities whose very existence defined the structure of the world itself. Among them Gaia, embodiment of the earth, Uranus, the endless sky, Pontus, the restless sea, and Tartarus, the living abyss, and unlike later gods, the Primordials were not rulers in the traditional sense. They did not govern through law or order, but through presence. their conflicts manifesting as creation itself. Mountains rising, oceans carving the land, and the sky tearing free from the ground through acts of violence rather than design. And it was during this era that the first great pattern of the God of War universe was established, that existence is shaped through struggle, and that power seeks expression before it seeks stability. The first great conflict erupted between Gaia and Uranus, a clash that reshaped reality when Uranus was cast down, his blood giving rise to the Titans, beings more defined than the Primordials, yet still deeply bound to elemental force and emotion. And in this moment, the cycle of overthrow was born, because even at the dawn of existence, rulership was temporary, and fear of replacement became the defining instinct of those who held power. Uranus cursed his children as he fell, foretelling his own destruction, and in doing so, planted the idea that survival required domination rather than coexistence, a belief that would echo across every divine generation that followed. The Titans inherited a world still unstable, still unfinished, and though they brought a measure of structure to reality, their rule was built on suppression rather than harmony, as they imposed order through fear, strength, and absolute authority, with mortals existing beneath them as insignificant witnesses to divine conflict, their lives shaped by disasters they could neither comprehend nor prevent. And while the Primordials faded from direct influence, they did not vanish entirely. Instead, their essence was absorbed into the fabric of the world itself, becoming the foundation upon which later gods unknowingly stood, which is why the land continues to react violently to divine death long after the Primordials are gone, because the world remembers what forged it, and cannot forget the forces embedded within its bones. This first war of creation, therefore, establishes the central tragedy of God of War, that every generation of gods believes itself different, wiser, and more deserving, yet repeats the same mistakes, mistaking strength for permanence, control for order, and prophecy for salvation. And as the Titans rose to claim the world as their own, believing the chaos had ended, the seeds of their downfall were already present, embedded within the very system of power they inherited, ensuring that creation itself was never a beginning, but the first step in an endless cycle of rise, fear, and inevitable collapse. With the Primordials diminished, and their essence no longer acting directly upon the world, the Titans rose as the inheritors of a reality already shaped by violence, instability, and unfinished creation. And although they represented a more defined and structured generation of divine beings, they were still ruled by unchecked emotion, instinct, and fear rather than wisdom or restraint. And during the age of the Titans, the world entered a fragile and conditional equilibrium, where mountains held their shape, seas followed predictable tides, and the sky remained separated from the land. Yet this balance was not born from care or stewardship, but enforced through domination, as the Titans ruled not as guardians of existence, but as absolute authorities, whose presence alone bent reality to their will, and whose disputes manifested as earthquakes, storms, and mass extinction without intent or remorse. And at the center of this era stood Kratos, ruler of the Titans, whose reign embodied the fundamental flaw of Titan authority, because upon hearing the prophecy that one of his children would one day overthrow him, Kratos did not seek understanding, humility, or change, but instead responded with terror, attempting to annihilate the future itself by devouring his offspring at birth, an act that revealed a core truth of the God of War universe, that prophecy does not create fate, but exposes the inner nature of those who hear it. And Kratos' choice ensured that the cycle of violence would not end, but deepen as the children he consumed continued to exist, imprisoned within him, their survival itself becoming a growing contradiction that weakened him from within, and guaranteed that the prophecy would one day be fulfilled, During this age, Gaia, who had once opposed Uranus and later supported Kronos, began to recognize a recurring pattern in divine rule, that no generation truly learned from the last, and her eventual decision to aid Zeus was not born of justice or hope, but of calculated desperation, a belief that replacing a ruler might somehow break a cycle that had already proven resilient to change. And so the great war between Titans and Olympians erupted, a conflict of unimaginable scale that tore the world apart. As Titans hurled mountains, Olympians wielded newly forged divine weapons, and entire regions of the world were shattered, drowned, or burned in battles that spanned years and left permanent scars upon reality itself. And when Zeus and his siblings finally emerged victorious, imprisoning the Titans within Tartarus and casting Kronos into eternal torment, they declared the dawn of a new age, believing themselves wiser, stronger, and destined to rule forever. Yet in that very moment, the seeds of ruin were already sown, because Zeus inherited not only his father's throne, but his fear of prophecy, his obsession with control, and his willingness to sacrifice anything to preserve power. And thus the age of the Titans did not end as a closed chapter of history, but as a warning ignored, a reflection of Olympus' future collapse embedded directly into the foundation of its rise, ensuring that the gods who claimed to bring order to the world were already walking the same path that had doomed their predecessors. With the Titans defeated, imprisoned within Tartarus, and erased from the surface of the world, Olympus rose as the new center of divine authority, and the Olympian gods proclaimed themselves saviors of existence, believing their victory marked the end of chaos and the beginning of a perfected order. Yet the structure they created was built upon the same foundations that had doomed the Primordials and the Titans before them. Because Olympus was not established as a realm of balance or guidance, but as a fortress of hierarchy, power, and fear, with Zeus at its center, ruling not merely as king of the gods, but as an absolute authority whose will defined law, fate, and punishment. And under his reign, the Olympians reshaped the world to reflect their dominance, carving cities from stone, raising temples in their own image, and binding mortals into systems of worship that reinforced divine supremacy rather than mutual coexistence. And while some regions flourished under divine favor, this prosperity was conditional, dependent on obedience, sacrifice, and reverence, as mortals were never partners in the Olympian vision, but resources whose faith sustained divine power, and whose suffering was acceptable collateral in divine conflict. Among the Olympians, Athena emerged as the embodiment of intellect, strategy, and foresight, positioning herself as Zeus' most trusted advisor. Yet her wisdom was inseparable from manipulation, as she guided events not toward peace, but toward outcomes that preserved Olympian rule, believing control to be preferable to chaos, while Ares embodied the raw violence of Olympus, delighting in endless war, spreading bloodshed across the mortal world, and using conflict as both entertainment and sustenance, his influence ensuring that humanity remained divided, fearful, and dependent upon divine intervention. Poseidon ruled the seas with volatile wrath, unleashing storms, earthquakes, and floods whenever his authority was challenged, while Hades governed the underworld not as a realm of moral judgment, but as a vast system of containment, ensuring the dead remained bound to Olympus' order, unable to disrupt the world of the living. And together, these gods formed a regime where balance was enforced through punishment, spectacle, and fear, rather than harmony or compassion. Prophecy continued to haunt Olympus despite its victory, because Zeus, having overthrown his own father, became increasingly obsessed with preventing the same fate from befalling him. And this paranoia drove acts of cruelty, betrayal, and preemptive violence, including the imprisonment of threats, both real and imagined, and the persecution of gods and mortals alike whose existence hinted at potential rebellion. And in this way, Olympus became a realm defined not by wisdom, but by anxiety, where every decision was shaped by fear of replacement, and every prophecy was treated as an enemy to be destroyed, rather than a warning to be understood. Beneath the splendor of Olympus, the world bore the cost of divine insecurity, as plagues, droughts, and wars erupted whenever the gods quarreled, and mortals were left to endure consequences they neither caused nor comprehended. And although the Olympians presented themselves as eternal and unassailable, their rule was already unstable because it depended on suppression rather than transformation. And thus, long before Kratos was ever born, Olympus was already straining under its own contradictions, powerful enough to dominate the world, yet incapable of escaping the cycle of fear and violence that would inevitably give rise to its destroyer. Kratos was born into the unforgiving militarized culture of Sparta, a society engineered around obedience, endurance, and warfare, where children were raised not as individuals with futures, but as tools forged for survival and conquest. And from his earliest memories, his life was shaped by pain, discipline, and competition, as Spartan youths were subjected to brutal trials designed to strip away weakness and reward ruthlessness. And within this system, Kratos learned that mercy invited death, that hesitation meant failure, and that worth was measured only through victory. Yet even among Spartans, his fate was unusually burdened, because alongside his younger brother Deimos, he became entwined in a prophecy that foretold the destruction of Olympus at the hands of a marked warrior. And when this prophecy reached Zeus, it awakened the same ancient terror that had driven Uranus and Kronos before him, because Zeus interpreted fate not as guidance, but as a threat to be eliminated. And in his fear, he ordered Ares and Athena to intervene, resulting in the violent abduction of Deimos, whose birthmark was mistaken as the sign of the prophesied destroyer, while Kratos was left behind, powerless to act, believing his brother murdered and internalizing a crushing sense of guilt and inadequacy that would shape every decision he made thereafter. Consumed by grief and self-hatred, Kratos threw himself fully into warfare, rising through the Spartan ranks with unnatural speed as his ferocity, tactical instinct, and disregard for his own life made him both feared and revered. And with each conquest, his reputation grew, yet his victories brought no peace, because they were driven not by honor or duty, but by an unspoken need to fill the void left by loss. And as his campaigns expanded beyond mortal limits, Kratos eventually faced annihilation at the hands of a barbarian king whose forces overwhelmed his army. And in that moment of absolute desperation, with death imminent, Kratos cried out not in reverence, but in surrender, offering his life and eternal service to any power that would grant him victory. And Ares answered, binding Kratos' soul to him through the blades of chaos, weapons forged in the depths of the underworld, seared into Kratos' flesh with chains that could never be removed, marking the instant when Kratos ceased to be a man who wielded weapons and became a weapon himself, an extension of divine violence unleashed upon the world. Under Ares' command, Kratos led campaigns of devastation across Greece, toppling cities, burning temples, and slaughtering entire populations without restraint, believing that obedience might one day earn absolution. Yet Ares' intention was never loyalty, but transformation, as he sought to strip Kratos of empathy and humanity by forcing him into increasingly brutal acts, culminating in the ultimate betrayal when Ares manipulated events to guide Kratos into a temple where his wife, Lysandra, and daughter Calliope had been hidden. And in his bloodlust, Kratos slaughtered them with his own hands, unaware until it was too late. And as their blood soaked the floor, a village oracle cursed Kratos, binding the ashes of his murdered family permanently to his skin, ensuring that his guilt would never fade, that sleep would never come without torment, and that every reflection would remind him of what he had become. Shattered by this revelation, Kratos attempted to defy Ares, yet found himself trapped by the very pact he had sworn, and plagued by relentless visions, nightmares, and hallucinations. He sought escape even through death, only to be denied release. As every attempt to end his life failed, reinforcing the god's absolute ownership over him and deepening his resentment. And in his desperation, Kratos turned to Olympus itself, believing that service to the gods might quiet his suffering. Yet this belief became another chain, because the Olympians never intended forgiveness, only utility. And over 10 years of servitude, Kratos completed impossible labors, slaying monsters, enacting divine will, and sacrificing what little remained of his identity, until the man he once was faded entirely, leaving behind the ghost of Sparta, a being defined not by destiny, but by pain, rage, and manipulation, methodically shaped through prophecy, fear, loss, and divine cruelty into the very instrument of destruction Olympus had tried to prevent, unknowingly forging the force that would one day erase them all. For 10 long years after the murder of his family, Kratos existed in a state of suspended torment, bound to the will of Olympus, and driven by the carefully maintained illusion that faithful service might one day bring him peace. And during this decade, he was sent across the Greek world to confront horrors that reflected the gods' own cruelty, slaying hydras, gorgons, harpies, minotaurs, and ancient beasts not as heroic trials, but as acts of divine maintenance, designed to eliminate threats inconvenient to Olympian rule, while simultaneously keeping Kratos exhausted, isolated, and dependent. And throughout these labors, Athena positioned herself as his sole advocate, speaking softly of redemption and eventual forgiveness, while carefully ensuring that neither ever truly arrived, because her intent was not Kratos' salvation, but his containment, as a controlled weapon whose rage could be aimed outward, away from Olympus itself, until the moment he was no longer useful, plagued constantly by visions of his wife and daughter, their voices echoing through his mind and denying him rest. Kratos sought escape even through death, yet was denied release, as every attempt to end his life failed, reinforcing the god's absolute ownership over him, and deepening his understanding that his suffering was not an accident of fate, but a condition deliberately sustained by divine hands. This realization slowly eroded what remained of his faith in the Olympians, as he came to see that his pain served a purpose, not justice, but control, and that the gods who promised mercy had no intention of granting it. This tension reached its breaking point when Ares, intoxicated by his own power, attempted to overthrow Olympus itself, and Kratos was commanded to confront the very god who had ruined his life. And in preparing for this trial, Kratos learned the final cruelty of his servitude, that even if he killed Ares, the gods would not erase his memories, nor absolve his sins, offering only freedom from nightmares. Not forgiveness, yet driven by hatred, endurance, and a desire to end his torment at any cost. Kratos accepted the challenge, and through suffering, ingenuity, and sheer will, he defeated Ares, tearing down a god who believed himself untouchable, and in doing so fulfilled Olympus' immediate need. Yet his victory brought no peace, because the gods honored their promise in the narrowest sense possible, silencing his nightmares while leaving his guilt intact, and elevating him to the throne of the god of war, believing this promotion would bind him more tightly to their order. As the new god of war, Kratos found himself isolated within Olympus, feared rather than welcomed, his brutality reflecting too clearly the god's own nature. And Zeus in particular treated him not as a brother, but as a volatile threat, restricting his influence, denying him respect, and watching him closely. And this rejection, combined with the realization that godhood had not freed him from pain, but merely transformed it, ignited a simmering rage that no longer sought redemption, but clarity. As Kratos began to question the legitimacy of gods who ruled through deception, fear, and broken promises, and it was within this space, between divine elevation and spiritual emptiness, that the ghost of Sparta ceased to believe in salvation entirely, and instead began to look upon Olympus not as his master, but as a prison, and eventually as an enemy. Kratos' descent into open defiance did not erupt in a single moment of fury, but unfolded slowly, shaped by years of betrayal, humiliation, and the dawning realization that Olympus had never intended to release him from suffering. Because as a god, he discovered that elevation only made his chains more ornate, not weaker, and when Zeus, driven by the same paranoia that had consumed every divine ruler before him, stripped Kratos of his godhood and cast him down from Olympus, repeating the ancient pattern of father turning against son, something fundamental fractured. As Kratos finally understood that the cycle was not an accident of fate, but a deliberate structure maintained through fear and violence. And in that understanding his purpose shifted from survival to confrontation, leading him to ally with the Titans, not out of loyalty, forgiveness, or shared ideology, but because they represented the only remaining force capable of challenging Zeus' authority and exposing Olympus' vulnerability. And so the Second Great War began, a conflict that eclipsed all prior divine struggles in scale and consequence. As Titans clawed their way back into the world, Olympian gods unleashed the full extent of their unchecked power, and the natural order began to unravel under the strain of warring divinities. Seas rose, skies darkened, and the land itself cracked beneath the weight of beings whose existence was never meant to collide so violently. And as Kratos carved a path through Olympus, he did not merely fight gods. He dismantled the system that had defined his life, confronting each Olympian not as an abstract symbol of myth, but as a flawed tyrant whose death carried immediate and catastrophic repercussions, with Poseidon's fall unleashing oceans that drowned the coastlines and reshaped the world's geography, Hades' destruction shattering the boundary between life and death and releasing countless souls into chaos, Helios' demise extinguishing the sun and plunging the land into suffocating darkness, Hermes' death spreading decay and disease through stagnation and imbalance, and Hera poisoning the earth itself as fertility withered and life struggled to persist. Each divine death reinforcing a grim truth that the gods were not separate from the world they ruled, but embedded within it, and that their corruption had long been poisoning reality from within. Throughout this apocalypse, Athena remained a constant unseen presence, revealing herself as a being transformed by the release of hope at the end of the First War, guiding Kratos' actions subtly while concealing her own ambition to claim the power that would remain once Olympus fell, positioning herself not as a savior, but as the next potential ruler in a cycle she believed she could control. And as the war reached its inevitable conclusion, Kratos confronted Zeus, his father and the final embodiment of divine tyranny, in a battle that shattered what remained of Olympus, exposing that Zeus' greatest weakness had never been strength or authority, but fear, because every act meant to prevent prophecy had only accelerated its fulfillment. And when Zeus was finally slain, not only through brute force, but through Kratos' refusal to submit, forgive or forget, the Olympian era ended in ruin, leaving Greece broken, its gods extinguished, its natural order devastated, and Kratos standing amid the wreckage of a civilization destroyed not by monsters or invaders, but by its own rulers, having committed the ultimate act of patricide, not for power or ambition, but as the final violent punctuation at the end of a cycle that had consumed every generation of gods before him. When the final echoes of Olympus faded and the Olympian gods were extinguished, the world they had ruled did not pass gently into renewal, but instead entered a prolonged and uneven collapse, because the removal of a pantheon was not a careful severing, but a violent tearing away that left deep metaphysical wounds embedded in the land itself and in Greece. Yes, consequences unfolded slowly and relentlessly as oceans swallowed. Coastlines reshaped by Poseidon fall forests failed to recover from the poison left in the wake of Hera. Death the sky struggled to regain balance after Helios' extinction, and the boundary between life and death remained unstable. Long after Hades' destruction, leaving restless souls wandering and mortals uncertain whether the afterlife still awaited them at all. And in this broken landscape, civilizations did not celebrate liberation, but endured confusion, fear, and scarcity. Forced to survive without divine order, yet still suffering the consequences of divine excess. And at the center of this aftermath stood Kratos, a being who should not have endured, yet remained bound to existence, not as a god ruling over ruins, nor as a savior rebuilding the world, but as a living remnant of a cycle that had ended violently and without resolution. And as he wandered through the remains of Greece, Kratos did not find peace and victory because the silence left behind by the gods carried weight rather than relief, revealing that vengeance could expose truth but could not repair what had been fundamentally broken. And while mortals struggled to adapt, rebuilding settlements and rediscovering meaning without the certainty of worship or prophecy, Kratos carried the heavier burden of awareness, knowing that the gods' downfall had been necessary, yet incomplete, because the ideology that sustained them, control through fear hierarchy, through power and order through domination, did not die with them. And this truth was revealed fully when Athena appeared in her altered form, a being reshaped by hope, who believed herself uniquely suited to guide the world beyond Olympus, yet whose vision still relied on authority and obedience. And when she demanded that Kratos surrender the power within him so that she might rule wisely, he recognized that the cycle had merely shifted shape rather than ended, and in refusing Athena, Kratos rejected not only her claim, but the very premise that the world required gods to govern it, choosing exile over dominion and distance over power. And in that decision, Greece was left to heal slowly, imperfectly, and painfully without divine intervention, while Kratos turned away from the land of his birth, carrying with him the knowledge that ending a cycle does not undo its cost, and that survival after the gods is not a triumph, but a quiet endurance, shaped by scars that may never fully fade. After turning away from the shattered remains of Greece, Kratos entered a prolonged period of exile, defined not by a clear destination, but by deliberate distance, as he moved steadily beyond the reach of the land that had shaped and broken him, seeking separation rather than meaning. And during these long silent years, the nature of the world beyond Olympus slowly revealed itself, not as a single unified domain, but as a vast expanse of regions, each governed by its own divine order, belief, systems, and unseen boundaries. And while the exact path Kratos followed remains obscured, it is evident that crossing between pantheons was neither simple nor safe, requiring endurance, resilience, and a willingness to exist without protection or favor. And throughout this journey, Kratos did not travel as a conqueror seeking glory, nor as a pilgrim seeking redemption, but as a being attempting to unlearn violence, resisting the instinct to dominate every threat, and instead choosing to endure hardship without responding with annihilation. And in doing so, he confronted something far more difficult than battle: the absence of purpose. Because without gods to command him, without enemies to justify his rage, and without prophecy to define his future, Kratos was forced to exist with himself alone. And this isolation became both punishment and discipline, as he encountered cultures whose gods did not know his name, whose myths did not include his sins, and whose people neither feared nor revered him, stripping away the identity of God's lair and leaving only a man burdened by memory and responsibility. And as the years passed, the rage that had once consumed him did not vanish, but settled inward, transforming into restraint, a form of control forged not through denial, but through constant effort, shaped by the knowledge that unleashing violence was easy while preventing it required strength he had never needed before. And this era of silence was not empty, but formative. As Kratos learned to survive without war, to live without command, to carry guilt without allowing it to dictate every choice, and to accept that punishment was not always delivered through pain, but through endurance and reflection. And during these years he came to recognize that the gods he had destroyed were not anomalies, but manifestations of a broader pattern that extended across the world, that wherever gods ruled through fear, prophecy, and domination, collapse was inevitable, not because mortals rebelled, but because power resisted change, and this understanding did not grant him peace, but clarity, reinforcing his desire to remain distant from divine hierarchies and to sever his identity from godhood entirely. And by the time Kratos reached the distant northern lands, the ghost of Sparta had become something quieter, heavier, and more deliberate, a being still capable of immense violence, yet increasingly defined by the effort to never unleash it again, carrying with him the memory of a world destroyed by its gods, and the resolve to endure rather than repeat the cycle that had consumed every age before. When Kratos finally reached the distant northern lands, he entered a world that at first appeared quieter and more restrained than the chaos he had left behind, yet beneath its frozen stillness lay a structure just as rigid and ultimately just as fragile, because the Norse realms were bound together by Yggdrasil, the world tree, a living cosmic axis whose roots and branches connected distinct realities, each shaped by divine influence, cultural memory, and deliberate manipulation. And unlike Olympus, which ruled openly through spectacle, dominance, and fear, the Norse gods governed through knowledge secrecy and the careful control of narrative, allowing belief to function as both chain and shield. And at the center of this system stood Odin, a ruler who valued information above strength, foresight above honesty, and survival above balance. And under his watch the nine realms existed not as equals, but as managed territories measured for usefulness, with Asgard elevated and fortified, Midgard monitored and subtly restricted, and realms such as Vanaheim, Alfheim, and Svartalfheim destabilized, divided, or exploited to prevent unified resistance. And while Odin spoke endlessly of peace, wisdom, and order, his rule was sustained through constant surveillance, erased histories, manipulated alliances, and preemptive cruelty, ensuring that no challenge could form before it was understood, cataloged, and neutralized. Thor served as the visible embodiment of this authority, a god of overwhelming force whose violence enforced Odin's will, and whose legend was carefully cultivated to inspire terror rather than reverence, as stories of his wrath spread across the realms, discouraging defiance and reinforcing the belief that resistance was futile. While Freya, once a Vanir goddess of life, fertility, and balance, was bound into subservience through betrayal, loss, and magical constraint, her autonomy stripped as punishment for defying Odin's will, and her grief weaponized to keep her compliant and isolated. And Tyr, the Norse god most closely associated with unity, justice, diplomacy, and travel between realms, was removed from the world entirely, his absence creating a void where cooperation and hope should have existed, and allowing Odin to rewrite Tyr's legacy into myth distorted enough to discourage rebellion and justify isolation. The giants known as the Jotnar represented the greatest existential threat to Odin's vision, not because of physical power, but because of knowledge as their understanding of prophecy did not seek domination, but observation, adaptation, and acceptance. And for this reason, Odin orchestrated their near extinction, erasing their settlements, destroying their records, and hunting them across realms while secretly hoarding their insight, attempting to control fate itself while denying others access to the same understanding. And throughout the nine realms, prophecy remained omnipresent, etched into murals whispered through runes and preserved in memory yet. Unlike the Greek conception of fate as an external force imposed upon reality, Norse prophecy functioned as a recorded outcome, a future that existed because it was known, feared, and anticipated, and this collective belief shaped behavior, constrained choice, and ensured that Ragnarok loomed not as a distant possibility, but as an expected conclusion, shaping every decision made by gods and mortals alike. And within this world of controlled inevitability, suppressed truth, and quiet dread, Kratos. A rival went largely unnoticed by the gods, yet not by the land itself, because his presence carried the metaphysical weight of a collapsed pantheon and a broken cycle, and though the Norse world had not yet fallen, it already bore unmistakable signs of wrought imbalance, exploitation, and fear, masquerading as order, revealing that despite differences in culture, language, and myth, the pattern of divine rule remained unchanged, and that Ragnarok was not an anomaly waiting to arrive, but the natural end of a system built on control rather than transformation. When Kratos chose to remain in the Norse lands, he did so not as a god seeking dominion, nor as a warrior seeking conflict, but as a man attempting to erase himself from history. And in this deliberate withdrawal, he formed a fragile life with Fae, a giant whose understanding of prophecy was rooted not in submission, but in patience and perspective, and whose quiet strength allowed Kratos to believe for the first time that existence might be defined by something other than violence, and through her he became a father, a role he neither sought nor believed he deserved. Atreus embodied both the possibility of redemption and the terror of repetition, and from the beginning, Kratos raised his son through restraint, distance, and discipline, believing that emotional control was the only shield strong enough to prevent the rage and brutality he carried from taking root. Yet this approach created an emotional gulf as Atreus grew curious, compassionate, and hungry for understanding, while his father responded with silence, caution, and fear of truth. And when Faye died, her final request that her ashes be scattered from the highest peak forced father and son into the world together, transforming grief into journey and exposing the fragile foundation of their relationship as they were compelled to rely on one another without the buffer of isolation. As they traveled across the 9 realms, Atreus' identity began to unfold slowly and painfully, revealing his giant heritage and his true name, Loki, a revelation heavy with consequence because it placed him at the center of prophecy while simultaneously granting him the rare capacity to question it. And unlike Kratos, whose life had been shaped by gods who imposed fate through violence, Atreus grew surrounded by murals, visions, and stories that attempted to define his future before he could choose it, and this constant pressure manifested in confusion, arrogance, and emotional volatility as he struggled to reconcile compassion, curiosity, and emerging godhood within himself, and as Kratos withheld the truth out of fear that knowledge would destroy his son. Atreus interpreted silence as rejection, deepening the divide between them and mirroring the very cycle of misunderstanding that had defined Kratos' relationship with his own father. Throughout their journey, Kratos was forced to confront the consequences of his emotional detachment, learning through repeated failure that protection through silence breeds resentment, and that strength without empathy becomes another form of cruelty. And in guiding Atreus, he was challenged to abandon the Spartan belief that emotion is weakness, and instead teach restraint through understanding, patience, and example, a transformation that required him to confront his own past rather than bury it. And when Atreus learned of his godhood, he briefly succumbed to arrogance, cruelty, and entitlement, reflecting the worst aspects of the gods Kratos had destroyed, yet through lost confrontation and the painful realization that power without responsibility leads only to isolation, Atreus began to understand that identity is not defined by blood prophecy or ability, but by choice and accountability, and together father and son forged a new bond, not built on obedience, fear, or domination, but on shared responsibility, honesty, and growth, redefining what it meant to be a god, not as a ruler above mortals, but as a protector capable of restraint and compassion. And within this evolving relationship lay the true disruption to the Norse order, because the greatest threat to prophecy was not Kratos' strength, but Atreus' willingness to question inevitability, and Kratos' courage to allow his son to choose a future different from his own carrying with them the possibility that the cycle of gods and destruction might finally be broken, not through annihilation, but through understanding, endurance, and choice. Ragnarok in the Norse world was never merely a future event waiting to occur, but a narrative imposed upon gods and mortals alike, a conclusion repeated so often through prophecy murals and whispered expectation that it shaped behavior long before the first blow was struck. And within this system, the belief in inevitability became its own prison, because every action taken to prevent Ragnarok instead reinforced the path toward it, and Odin's obsession with rewriting fate only tightened its grip as he hoarded giant knowledge, manipulated alliances, imprisoned truths, and sacrificed entire realms in pursuit of a future he could control. And yet, when Ragnarok finally unfolded, it did so not as prophecy demanded, but as consequence shaped by choice, because Kratos and Atreus approached the end not as figures seeking to fulfill destiny, but as beings determined to minimize suffering even if destruction could not be entirely avoided. And this shift altered everything as alliances formed, not through fear, but through shared purpose, with realms long suppressed, rising not for vengeance, but for survival and meaning. And when the great battle came, gods fell not as symbols, but as individuals exposed by their decisions, with Heimdall undone by his inability to comprehend mercy, Thor confronting the emptiness behind his violence, and Odin and revealed as a ruler whose fear of death eclipsed any claim to wisdom. And as each of these figures fell, the world did not collapse into nothingness, but instead absorbed the shock, reshaping itself around the absence of tyrants rather than unraveling entirely. And at the center of this transformation stood sacrifice, not as ritual obligation, but as conscious choice, as Kratos confronted the vision of his own death and chose restraint over martyrdom, refusing to define his legacy through blood, while Atreus embraced responsibility, not by ruling, but by stepping away from the cycle to seek understanding rather than domination. And in doing so, father and son rewrote the meaning of Ragnarok from an unavoidable ending into a painful transition, a moment where loss and survival coexisted, and the future was no longer dictated by prophecy alone. And while the scars of the conflict would endure, the world emerged, not healed, but altered, no longer bound entirely by fear of what must happen, but open to the possibility of what could be chosen, marking the first true fracture in the cycle that had governed gods since the beginning. When the echoes of Ragnarok finally faded and the realms settled into an uneasy quiet, what remained was not triumph, clarity, or peace, but a fragile openness shaped by absence, because with the fall of Odin, the collapse of enforced prophecy, and the unraveling of divine surveillance, the Norse world was no longer guided by a single will or protected by an all-knowing authority. And into this uncertain space, Kratos remained not as a king, not as a god to be worshipped, and not as a symbol to be feared, but as a witness to the cost of every age he had survived, carrying within him the memory of Greece, ruined by arrogance, and the North scarred by control. And for the first time, his immense strength was no longer defined by conquest or vengeance, but by restraint, patience, and the conscious choice to stand guard rather than stand above. And as the murals that once foretold his death lost their authority, they were replaced not by new prophecy, but by action, as Kratos began to take on a quieter role within the realms, offering protection, guidance, and labor rather than command, revealing that legacy is not carved through fear or bloodshed, but through sustained presence and accountability over time. Atreus' absence from his side did not signal abandonment or fracture, but trust, because in allowing his son to leave, Kratos rejected the final temptation of control, understanding that cycles persist when parents bind children to their own unresolved past, and that true change requires separation growth and the freedom to choose differently. And as Atreus walked his own path, seeking out surviving giants and forgotten truths, not to master fate, but to understand it, his journey represented a future unshaped by domination, where knowledge served curiosity rather than power, and across the realms, mortals and lesser beings were forced to confront a new reality, where meaning no longer descended from gods, but had to be constructed through cooperation, memory, and shared survival. And though conflict, suffering, and hardship did not vanish, they now unfolded without the shadow of inevitability, because the future was no longer predetermined by prophecy, nor guarded by rulers. Terrified of change, in this fragile freedom carried its own dangers, requiring humility, vigilance, and endurance rather than obedience. Yet it marked the first era in which gods were no longer required for the world to persist, and as Kratos stood within this emerging age, neither absolved of his past nor condemned by it, he embodied the final lesson of the god of war world, that cycles do not end through destruction alone, but through the willingness to carry responsibility without domination, to remember the past without allowing it to dictate the future, and to accept that what truly remains after God's fall is not silence or ruin, but the slow, difficult work of choosing to be better than what came before. As this journey through the god of war world comes to rest, allow the weight of gods, fallen cycles broken, and futures uncertain to settle gently rather than loudly, because this story was never truly about destruction alone, but about what remains afterward, about the quiet moments where choice replaces prophecy, restraint replaces domination, and endurance becomes the strongest form of strength. And if you carry anything with you from these myths, let it be the understanding that even worlds shaped by violence can change, not through denial of the past, but through the courage to face it without repeating it. And as the silence returns and the echoes of ancient battles fade into memory, thank you for spending this time here, walking slowly through ruin, reflection, and renewal. And if you found comfort, clarity, or calm in this telling, consider leaving a like, subscribing to Midnight Lore Keeper, and returning whenever you need a place where lore is meant to be listened to, softly understood, deeply, and left behind gently as you rest.